Okay. Now here's another question. Do non-Muslim lives matter to Muslims? Do non-Muslim lives matter to Muslims? And so one of the reasons why I asked this question, two things that are sort of that I have sitting in my heart right now. And so I'm sure that we're all aware of the devastation that Turkey and Syria are currently experiencing as a result of this earthquake. And the thousands upon thousands of lives that have been lost, the thousands and thousands of people who died, either as a result of in the immediate aftermath of the earthquake, or hours and hours and hours, days perhaps, after not having people be able to save them in time, right? Men, women, children. And there's a way in which this tragedy has brought about a number of a lot of money, a lot of prayers, as it rightly should. Right? It's a tragedy. But I'm often concerned with the way in which we show a certain kind of concern when tragedy happens to Muslims. And we don't have it seems like we don't keep the same energy when tragedy happens to people who are not Muslim. An African-American man, Tyree Nichols, was recently murdered by the police in Memphis, Tennessee. And recently, it came out that he was Muslim, right? We have people in our community that have attested to the fact that he took his shahada and that he's a Muslim. And there's a way in which it seems to be that his being Muslim somehow renders his life more sacred in our communities, right? All of a sudden, for some people, his death is rendered more tragic somehow. And I'm concerned about this. I have to ask, what does this say about who we are as Muslims? What does it say about our communities? This raises questions for me, and I'm sure it raises questions for you too. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. And I have to apologize that, you probably weren't expecting me to get so heavy so quickly. But like I said, I think we have work to do, mostly on ourselves, right? All right, so 4 years ago, when I was teaching up in Cambridge, I engaged in some ethnographic research in order to present a paper on Black Muslim activism. And one of the people that I reached out to was Imam Abdullah Farouk of Masjid Alhamdulillah, which is, or the Mosque for Praising Allah, which is a masjid that is situated in Roxbury, in Boston, in the neighborhood of Roxbury in Boston. And I asked him about grassroots activism. And he said something that forever will stay with me. He said, we are the grass and the root. That is talking about Black Muslims. We are the grass and the root. When you're talking about grassroots, we are the grass and the root. And this was a very interesting thing that he said to me, because it makes me think of the way in which there's a sort of notion of a kind of a planting of Islam and the flowering of Islam that has occurred in the history of the United States, the history of Islam in the United States, right? And who planted that seed? continues to water it, and the way in which it sprouts out of the ground, right? In order to provide some benefit for society, right? So anyway, this is a masjid that is predominantly African American. And over the last however many years, it has increasingly Somali American Muslims have been drawn to this community because of the fact that varying kinds of migration patterns and the fact that there are a lot of Somali Muslims in and around Boston. Let's go to the next slide, please. When I asked him about activism, Imam Farouk talked to me about the work that they do in their community. And one of those efforts is the following, right? It's every weekend they feed people in their community. And so there's a way in which there's a real concern for, I should say, an understanding of Muslimness that comes with a certain responsibility to one's neighbor, to the society that one is in. And so as you can see here, just this, and hopefully you'll find this interesting in the way that I found it interesting. He showed me this picture on his phone and said that, as you can see here, we're sort of putting grocery bags together, right, for people who need it, right, who need to be able to feed their households. And so you can see the way in which they're inventorying what they have, the resources that they have to then dispense to the community that they're in, right, that they care for. Let's go to the next slide, please. And then he remarked on the way in which the geography of this, the vision of this, right, seems to be quite resonant with this food pantry effort on the part of the Black Panthers. You can see here Bobby Seale, right, standing amidst a number of different paper bags that are filled with groceries, and the intent of which is to give away to community members, right? This is how they care for their neighbors. This is how they care for their community. And one of the things that he said was, we weren't necessarily trying to fashion this sort of similarity. And I commented that the similarity is only produced not necessarily by the sort of aesthetic sort of similarity that's here, but the socioeconomic conditions that produce and result in the need for such programs in the first place, right? That in this predominantly Black and Latino working class neighborhood, right? Unfortunately, because of a lack of resources, there's a very real need for people to feed others. There's a very real need to be fed, right? And so one of the things that I did was I went around to a number of different masjids, but in particular, I wanted to stay in Roxbury. And if you know anything about Roxbury, you know that this is a neighborhood that Malcolm X came up in. When he moves to Boston to live with his sister Ella, he cuts his teeth as a young man, bouncing and bopping around Roxbury. And so this is the community that Malcolm X spends a lot of time in, right? Let's go to the next slide, please. And so there's a larger mosque, actually, that is in Roxbury as well. And ISBCC is this large architectural marvel, right? Millions of dollars of which has been had been sort of corralled and used to finance the building of this masjid, right? Very beautiful, wonderful community, etc. one of the other people that I was able to interview in preparation for providing some comments at this gathering at Harvard that I participated in talking about Black Muslim activism, I spoke to Imam Abdul Malik Merchant, who is no longer there. He's currently in DC, but at that time, I think he was an assistant imam of the masjid, the Islamic Society of Boston and Cultural Center. And it's situated quite literally on Malcolm X Boulevard, right? In Roxbury, in the same neighborhood that Masjid Alhamdulillah is situated in. Now, one of the differences between these two communities are the following, right? Masjid Alhamdulillah is a smaller, more modest building that is part of a larger row house, a building of row houses, right? And its constituency, right, is predominantly Black or of African descent. Most of the people who attend that masjid actually live in or around Roxbury or in some neighborhood nearby. On the other hand, ISBCC, again, situated quite literally on Malcolm X Boulevard, has a lot more Muslims who attend the masjid for Jummah on a daily basis. They have a bunch of different programs. There's a cafe inside. There's a bookshop, etc. Right? However, most of the people that attend this masjid commute in from the periphery of this neighborhood, the periphery of the city, actually. And so you have a lot of people who, a lot of Muslims who live out in the sort of suburbs or in the sort of peri-urban part of what surrounds Boston, right? As far as the sort of the socioeconomic standing of the people who attend this masjid, I would say they have a lot more resources than the people who attend Masjid Alhamdulillah. But in spite of that, during my conversation with Imam Abdul Malik Merchant, who's a dear friend of mine, he lamented at the way in which much of the resources that are used, that are garnered to fund programs at ISBCC, a tiny portion of that, only a tiny fraction of that is used for varying kinds of outreach. Whereas for Masjid Alhamdulillah, you can imagine that the resources that are used to feed people in their community comes at a great expense in relation to the total resources that Masjid Alhamdulillah has. And I really only draw this contrast in order to think about a couple of things, right? One of the things that I think about is the history of how masjids that are predominantly African American are situated in environments, are positioned, right, usually positioned to directly intervene and provide some benefit to the community that they're a part of. To provide for people who are less resourced, to advocate for others, right? To quite literally feed people. Whereas Muslim communities that tend to be more resourced don't necessarily do that. And in fact, in most cases, they aren't well positioned to do that because most of them are situated in suburbs or exurbs, et cetera, right? And this is due to a history that I'm not necessarily going to talk about here, but we can talk about it if you want to, but we're familiar with the sort of history of this geographical position, the socio-political and geographical positioning of certain masjids in the United States. But what concerns me more, actually, and this is actually a critique that I came to realize, and as I was sort of reflecting on what we could be doing more of, when I was thinking about a masjid that's in my community, right? That's of which many of the people who attend Jummah there and rely on that space as a space for sort of worship and care are people who were not born in this country or whose parents were not born in this country. And I'm not necessarily trying to draw a comparison between, African American and migrant Muslims. I'm not trying to do that, right? Because that's a sort of at this point an imprecise categorizing of how our Muslim communities are composed, are comprised today. But one of the